Hey guys, what's going on? It's me, Jay. Here again, talk a little bit about President's Day and a little bit about some of my favorites, some of my favorite presidents, and some of my not so favorites, and others were lame duck presidents, in my opinion. Keep in mind, uh, we've had 46 men be the president of the United States um, since the 1790s. Excuse me, the 1780s. 1788 was the first presidential election. So there have been good ones and there have been terrible ones. Some of the good ones, and again, this is not a personal characteristics, personal opinion. This is personal opinion. This is not, and based on what they did within the office of the presidency. Sure, some of them were horrible human beings. Some of them cheated on their wives. Some of them were slave owners. Some of them waged unjust wars in the name of the United States democracy, whatever. A lot of them were horrible towards the Native Americans. In fact, most of them were horrible towards the Native Americans throughout most of American history. Unfortunately, that is a aspect of American history that as we are proud to be Americans, we are proud of our country. We are not proud of some of the things that our country has done in the past. And these men have done personally. You know what I mean? Like they're human beings like us. We all have faults. We all have bad things about us. So I'll start off with George and good things. I'll start off with George Washington. George Washington is known as the father of our country. He is the um, the first commander of the Continental Army, the chief commander in the French and Indian War, as well as the American Revolutionary War. He is on the dollar bill. He has to be on the top of anyone's list because without him, there is no country. You know what I mean? And one of the things that I respected about him after his second term, he did step down because, again, the United States, and go back to um, where I talk about the Netflix series The Crown, where I say that the United States, in fighting the American Revolution, was not only fighting against Britain because we didn't have any representation in the British Parliament, but we were also fighting a war against monarchy. So it would have been highly stupid of George Washington to step down. To not step down after his second term and assume, a kingship role. And, he never had any natural born children of his own. So that was a good thing because they couldn't say, oh, well, no party could step up and say, well, oh, George Washington successor should be of his bloodline. This has happened throughout history in other empires, movements, what have you. People will come and say, well, the natural successor should be that person's son or that person's daughter in primogeniture. More specifically, son. We see that in the early history of Islam, where Prophet Muhammad dies, and then it's a debate between should the community of no children, Lisa. How's it going? The community of believers, the best amongst the Muslims, should they be the leader or the caliph, or should the leader or the caliph come from among the bloodline of Prophet Muhammad? The Shiites say it should be from the bloodline, and the Sunnis say that it should be the best amongst the believers in terms of piety. So we don't have that problem here in the United States. We didn't have that problem here in the United States because George Washington did not have any blood relatives. no children. So nobody could step up and be like, well, despite Washington stepping down after 2 terms, his daughter should be the new queen of the United States or the new president of the United States, or his son should be um, the new president or king of the United States. We didn't have that problem. We didn't have a leadership crisis in that. And he also didn't want to serve until life. We see even in our modern era that once a leader gets the reins of power, he is very hesitant to submit it. For example, Mohammed Gaddafi or Fidel Castro, they claim that they are doing it for the liberty and for the freedoms of their people, but they really want to be presidents for life. And, you know, the United States was against that from the very beginning, from the very start. The United States was against doing that. We fought a war against monarchy. Why would we have a monarchy of our very own? And a lot of the people in the republic, in the republic at that time, in the country at that time, wanted George Washington to be a king because they were so used to kings throughout their history, throughout all of human history. That's all we've ever had, really, in terms of government, is kings and queens. You know what I mean? So they wanted George Washington to assume that absolute leadership role, and he did not do that. He stepped down after 2 terms. In fact, it was his quote that absolute power corrupts absolutely, and he didn't want absolute power. He stepped down, and that was one of the rarest things ever for a leader in human history to do, and he set the precedent, if you will, for the rest of the presidents only to serve 2 terms, with the exception of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now, my second favorite president after him would have to be Abraham Lincoln, the 16th president of the United States. The person that I considered that kept this country together, that rebuilt this country after it was torn asunder by the Civil War. Long story short, because of the issue of slavery, and I don't want to hear anybody in the comment section say that it was any other issue. It wasn't the issue of taxation. It wasn't the issue of tariffs, as the South often puts it. It was the issue of slavery. The South feared that Abraham Lincoln was an abolitionist president, that he was going to abolish the unjust system that kept African Americans enslaved in this country since the very beginning. And they seceded from the Union. 11 states in the southeastern part of the United States decided that they were going to rebel against the United States and form their own government. And Abraham Lincoln, during this time, was able to lead the troops as the commander-in-chief, able to assume the reins of power that he needed to at the time to not only defeat the South and put down that rebellion and keep the country together, but also through the Emancipation Proclamation was able to emancipate the slaves. So for that, he deserves ultimate props, because if George Washington is the father of the first American Revolution, Abraham Lincoln definitely is the father of the second American Revolution, when freedom, liberty, and democracy was extended to all citizens, irregardless of race, at least for a time. Obviously, because of his assassination, he wasn't able to carry out a lot of the civil rights the civil rights measures that he would have had to. He was assassinated in in the 1860s by John Wilkes Booth, an actor who was a Confederate sympathizer in Ford's Theater. He wasn't able to carry out the exact civil rights le- um, measures and legislations that he would have liked to because he was assassinated. So it would take another president to do that. And that other president is my third pick, and that is John F. Kennedy. Now, John F. Kennedy did not put through the legislation, the Voting Rights Act of 1965 or the Civil Rights Act of 1964, but he did get the ball rolling for that. Now, some people will say, just like they will with Lincoln, they will say, well, initially he wasn't for civil rights. He initially was not for ending the system of Jim Crow, the system of segregation that had been instituted in 1894 by the ruling of Plessy versus Ferguson that established separate but quote unquote equal but really unequal rights for African Americans and whites. He was not really for that. He was not for using federal troops. That he was pushed to that because of the civil rights unrest and because of the civil rights movement, Rosa Parks and Martin Luther King and the Montgomery bus boycotts. That is kind of true, kind of not true. He was for it privately, but you have to understand that from the very beginning of the country till the present day, we have regionalism in this country. We have certain regions go along with things and certain other regions don't. And a president just cannot make a certain region of the country do whatever he or maybe in the future she would want them to do. In the South, from the time of the American Revolution to the time of Abraham Lincoln to the time we're talking about right now, John F. Kennedy, till even today, has always been against federal overreach. They've always been against the federal government in Washington, D.C., imposing its will on them from the point of view that they see it. They've also been racist and white supremacist and very conservative. And also, to add to that, initially JFK could not come out for civil rights because he was a Democrat, and part of the Democratic constituency was the Southern states. At that time, the South was called the Solid South, and they were part of the people that got him elected, even though at that time he was looked at with a great deal of suspicion from the South, because just like with Lincoln, they feared that he would, and just like they feared Lincoln would end slavery, they feared that Kennedy would end segregation because he was a Northern liberal and he was a Catholic, and that part of the country was, and probably always will be staunchly Protestant, staunchly Christian, mostly Southern Baptist. So they questioned him on his Catholicism, they questioned him on his liberal politics, being from Massachusetts, and they questioned if he would try to end what they perceive as their way of life, segregation, and the unjust treatment of African Americans. He, like Lincoln, was not able to do that because he was assassinated in 1963 by Lee Harvey Oswald. Supposedly, we don't know if it was really Lee Harvey Oswald because Lee Harvey Oswald himself died by the hands of Jack Ruby. another guy like a couple of hours later. So, according to Lee Harvey Oswald, it wasn't him, but he was a patsy. He was set up. But we don't really know who murdered Kennedy that day in Dallas, Texas in 1963, but we know that he was assassinated. So, his predecessor, Lyndon Baines Johnson, was the one who eventually passed the Civil Rights Act of 64 and 65 because of the goodwill that he had from the Kennedy assassination. A lot of people were behind that administration because of the tragedies they suffered. So they were ready to get with his program, get behind his program of ending Jim Crow and finally overturning centuries and centuries of unjust treatment of African Americans, going back to the beginning of the Republic, to the beginning before there even was a country, when the first English settlers came onto the soil in 1619, and even before that in 1501 with the Spanish. You know what I mean? So we're talking about centuries and centuries of discrimination that Kennedy was trying to end. Kennedy and Johnson administration was trying to end. I don't include Johnson in this because although he did that in Kennedy's name and with the goodwill of Kennedy, he also launched a very unjust and unpopular war in Southeast Asia to expand U.S. influence. And that to me takes points away from his legacy because when people remember him, they'll remember him for the Vietnam War and the mishandlings of the Vietnam War more so than they'll remember him for the things that he did well in civil rights. But Johnson himself, when he was a teacher in his home state of Texas, he saw how Mexican people were treated. Mexican people were also subject to the kinds of discriminations in the states that there was a large percentage of Mexicans, like Texas. In fact, one of the first landmark civil rights cases in terms of desegregation of schools, even before Brown versus Board of Ed in the same year in 1954, with the same judge, Judge Warren, was judge. A state level ruling, Hernandez versus the state of Texas, that ended school segregation specifically in Texas. You know what I mean? So they used that as a precedent to later go on to a federal case and ending school segregation as a whole. But during his time as a teacher in Texas, he saw how segregation affected minorities and it really impacted him. Now, some people say, his detractors, that he only did it so that African Americans could, be on the side of the Democratic Party. And there's that famous quote, I'll have N-words voting Democrat for the next 200 years if I pass this. And maybe that was true. He knew that by expanding voting rights in the South to black people and to other minorities, by passing the civil rights legislation, he would be gaining the African American support. Previously, most African Americans had supported the Republican Party because Lincoln was a Republican, the first Republican president, and it was the Republicans that were founded, instrumental in ending slavery, and they were instrumental in the abolitionist movement. In fact, that's why they split off from the Whigs, because the Whigs were split. There were Northern Whigs, and then there were Cotton Whigs and the Whigs in the South. But the Republicans were solidly for ending slavery. But by the time we get around to the 20th century and the debates in the 60s, it's completely different. You know what I mean? Republicans are mostly for the rich, they're pro business party, and they really are not for expanding civil rights. So maybe it's true that Johnson did think, by expanding civil rights in the South, I will get a lot of black voters, for the for the Democratic Party, and they will be solidly behind me because I did this. You know what I mean? Because he was a student of history and he did understand that that's what it did for the Republican Party because black people that could vote, after the Civil War, like those living in the northern states, they did vote for Republicans. So he wanted to, I guess, the same thing for the Democratic Party in a new century. And he understood by expanding this right in the South, yeah, they will be behind me. But keep in mind, he also risked losing the Dixiecrats, the Southern Democrats, because he knew that they were going to switch parties. Once he did this, once he pushed that button for the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, and he supported Martin Luther King, he knew, hey, we've lost the South. We've lost that voting base. They're never going to vote for us again. So we've gained African Americans, but we've lost poor whites. The poor whites are out. They're going to switch Republican. And so, yeah, we've got African Americans in the South and in the North because they're going to switch. The ones in the North that were already Republican, they're going to switch Democrat. But we've lost the poor whites. You know what I mean? So he was doing a good thing for his party, sure, but he was also running a risk. At the same time. You know what I mean? So he did stick his neck out there. Now, whether or not he said that quote about the N word, I don't know. That's alleged. I wasn't there. I didn't hear him say that. You know what I mean? But that's what people often say that, nowadays that are against Democrats. They say, well, Johnson was just using like people like Candace Owens. They said, well, Johnson was just using black people so that the Democrats could stay in power and the Democrats could have their vote forever. But that's what political parties do. Like that's politics. They offer certain groups, certain lobbyists, favors in exchange for their vote. That's what Trump did with the evangelicals. So that is not, there's nothing strange about that. Like certain politicians will say, if you, put me as your candidate, I will do certain things. I will pass legislation for your group. I will push for the rights and the representation of your group. That's what representative democracy is. So other than his use of the N word, I don't really see anything necessarily wrong with what he said. you know, you know what I mean? Me personally, you know what I mean? Um, Going back around to Thomas Jefferson. Now, Thomas Jefferson is a very controversial figure in American history. Why I put him on my list as a one that I do like is, remember when I said not for them personally? You know what I mean? He was somebody that was a slave owner. He was a rapist. He was an ardent racist who did not believe that um, African Americans and whites were equal to one another. He was totally against African Americans, was Thomas Jefferson. How you can believe that whites and blacks should not intermingle, yet yourself have black children as a result of the rape of Sally Hemings is completely reprehensible. But, and he was a white supremacist. But he does get good points in the sense that he was the architect, the intellectual architect, because I said in the other video, the previous President's Day video, he was the intellectual architect of the American Republic. It was him who authored the Declaration of Independence. It was him who put most of the ideas of the American Revolution pen to paper. So if it wasn't for him, we wouldn't have these ideas formulated into official ideas, official documents. He was the brains behind the operation. If George Washington was McCartney, he was John Lennon. He was the one behind George Washington, you know, leading the American revolutionaries in the intellectual side. He was a student of philosophy. He was a student of history, especially Greco-Roman history. He understood how fragile a republic can be. Because remember, guys, Rome was a republic before it was an empire, but they could not hold it. Other than Benjamin Franklin, he was probably the most intellectual of the founding fathers and of the presidents we had. As far as him as a president, he did launch our first war in the early 1800s. It was called the Barbary Coast War, and it was against people of the Barbary Coast, the coast of North Africa. We have something in our marine hymn that says, "From the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli, we'll fight our country's battle on the air, the land, and sea." And it was because of this war in 1803 that President Jefferson was going to free a bunch of American seamen that had been caught by these North African pirates. North Africans, just like people in the rest of the Muslim world at that time, and pretty much throughout Western history, have always had this kind of animosity and competition between the West, us, and parts of the Muslim world, and they viewed the new American Republic just as the same as they have viewed other European countries. So they captured our American seamen, and they held them enslaved for a while. Yes, there was, the Muslim countries did have white slaves, and it was up to the newly formed American Marines to free them, and that's what they did. And that was technically the first post-American Revolutionary War in U.S. history. So he holds the reins for that. Also, the Louisiana Purchase, he expanded the American territory. He doubled in its size with the purchase of Louisiana territories from Napoleon in 1803. Also that same year, Napoleon was going broke because he lost the Haitian Revolution. When he tried to reinvade Haiti, he also lost a lot of the Napoleonic Wars in Russia. So Napoleon needed the money, so he sold the entire Louisiana territory to the United States at that time. So in the ironic twist of Thomas Jefferson's life, here he was a strict constitutionalist. He did not believe that the president and the executive branch of power should overstep its government, and he believed in sticking to the letter of the law of the U.S. Constitution of the government. And if he himself had been a congressman or a senator at the time when he was president, he would have vetoed the Louisiana Purchase because he would have considered it an overstep of executive powers. But he did it. You know what I mean? So He was a man of many contradictions. Here's a guy who's an ardent racist, an ardent white supremacist, a slave owner, and yet even though he believed in white separation, he had half black children. And even though he was a strict constitutionalist, he doubled the size of the United States. So who knows? People could write essays on the life of Thomas Jefferson and how many contradictions the man himself had. You know, he spoke out of two sides of his mouth, really. He was so intellectual and so smart. He was too smart for his own good. He would find himself in his words and deeds disagreeing with his own self. you know, you know what I mean? So, but he's up there among my favorites. Just for that, not for his personal character. Personal character, he could go to hell for what he did to Sally Hemings. We're still going to talk about it. It is what it is. He was a racist, but without him, we wouldn't have the country we have. We are all living in a Jeffersonian democracy, as Ronald Reagan said. And that brings me to another person, Franklin Delano Roosevelt. Now he is also among my favorites. He was the only president ever in history to serve more than 2 terms. He became the president in 1932 at a time when we were dealing with a global depression, the fallout from the stock market crash in 1929, which was the worst stock market crash in our country's history at that time. This, again, like with George Washington, this would have been a perfect time, and this did happen in other countries. This happened in Germany with the rise of Adolf Hitler. It happened in Italy with the rise of Benito Mussolini. You know what I mean? Where people saw that, there was desperation. People saw that there was economic depression, and they stepped in and they assumed absolute power. They took advantage of a terrible situation. They took advantage of a society's vulnerability, and they used it to step in to assume absolute power and institute fascism. Some would say that's exactly what happened in the Soviet Union under Joseph Stalin as well. So this would have been a perfect time for FDR to do such a thing. He could have just threw out the Constitution, wiped his butt with the Constitution, said, you know what, forget about separation of powers, forget about the traditions that we have in this country, of democracy, of representative government, of liberty, and just throwing the whole thing out and just said, forget the whole thing. We're reorganizing the country. We're taking advantage of a poor economic situation. And I'm going to stay the president forever. He did die in office, but it was because he was reelected. It wasn't because he said, you know what, we're going to do away with elections and just to hell with it. He could have done that because, see, here's the thing, and I talked about this in the Afghanistan video when I said why a lot of people were gravitating towards the Taliban, in 2020 in a time of COVID. Because when things get bad, people go back to assurities. People want security. So they'll go back to a more absolutist or a more monarchical or a more tyrannical or authoritarian form of government because it makes them feel safe. So they're like, okay, yeah, it might not be might not have the best freedom, but I feel safe under it. I'm scared of what may happen next. And then they respond to a strong leader, what they call in the Spanish countries and the Latino countries, they call it a caudillo. A strong leader, a strong charismatic leader that will tell us what we need to do to get right on the right track. And that person will then use that time of desperation to take advantage of the people's, hurt. that has happened in all throughout history. Because most people are followers. Most people, they don't want to think for themselves. They want to be told what to think. You know what I mean? So they respond to strong, charismatic leaders such as Mussolini or Hitler or Joseph Stalin or even FDR. But FDR didn't do that. FDR kept our traditions the way they were. And not only that, but he got a lot of things passed for people with disabilities. The first Social Security Acts, he got passed. The first labor laws, he got passed. A whole bunch of stuff within the framework of the New Deal. He did take advantage of the situation in a sense by instituting the New Deal and by using, you know, by expanding the power of government to a certain extent, but not to a maximum, like he could have. Like this next person, I feel tried to do. And this person is the first person that I will rank as my top worst list. And this is Donald J. Trump, the 45th president of the United States. I feel like the situation that we were in 2015 with the rise of ISIS, with the rise of a lot of these shootings, when Trump came in, he tried to do the things that a lot of these bad leaders did in the 40s. You know what I mean? He tried to take advantage of the situation and use it to maximize his own power. And people, just like they did back then, they felt for it. And they're like, okay, yeah, this is what we need. This is what we want. A strong leader. We want somebody to tell it like it is. And, that's, he was supposedly telling it like it is. But by telling it like it is, he was just insulting people. He wasn't making informed intellectual decisions, you know, out trying to, just like, okay, here he is with, like Washington, like Lincoln, like Kennedy, like FDR. He was faced with crisis. And how did he respond to the crisis? Not let's put America on the right track. Let's put the power in the hands of the people. Again, he responded to it by putting the power, more of the power, in the hands of himself and the people that were his cronies at the time. That was much different than this other person. That is my last person in the like category. As far as I don't like Trump, I'll get back around to him, Lisa, and I'll answer that question. This next person also faced with a crisis, also faced with the crisis of 2008, which at that time was the worst economic depression that we'd ever seen since FDR, and was kind of like an FDR, a Kennedy, and a Washington and a Lincoln all rolled into one. And this person was Barack Obama. Barack Obama made history being the first African American president, being the son of a Kenyan and the son of a woman from Kansas, electrifying people in his 2004 campaign speech for John Kerry. So although John Kerry did not win, the takeaway that we got from the John Kerry Bush election was that there was this young senator from Chicago, Illinois, Barack Obama, and he was just electrifying people. And he had a chant of "Yes, we can." And he was the first president to really use the internet. A lot of these presidents, they were landmark, and they were changing in a sense in how they used the technology of their day. We talked about Jefferson, yeah. We talked about Jefferson and his use of the written word. We didn't touch really on Kennedy and his use of TV. It was the use of television that really got him elected in 1960 because he had the debate with Nixon and Nixon was sweating. Nixon was more used to radio where you couldn't really see the person, and Kennedy was used to TV, and Kennedy was more handsome, more charismatic, and that helped him get elected. It was the invention of television that really propelled him. Likewise with FDR in the 30s and 40s, radio was coming out, and FDR was a great speaker and a great orator, and he had used his great oratory speeches to really calm the nation and keep the nation at ease with his fireside chats, during his presidency. So Obama was very similar. Obama utilized the internet. Obama was young, he was a Gen Xer, and he really epitomized the time. And I remember being on the internet at that time, being on YouTube when YouTube was first starting, and the level of excitement that was surrounding the aura of possibly electing the country's first African American president, really healing the wounds and really seeing the trajectory between, okay, the founding of the country, then Abe Lincoln, the Civil War, the abolitionist movement, and then the Civil Rights Movement with Kennedy. And then now this was our version of that, electing the country's first African American president. Lisa and I we could remember seeing the excitement, being a part of the excitement, seeing the long lines around the block when I went to go cast my vote for him. Uh, I never saw long lines like that. And my family was very political. My grandmother worked the polls a few times, and she always took me to go, vote in all the elections that I was alive for. Yeah, we were able to vote, Lisa. You're right. And seeing those long lines around the block in my neighborhood, people that I didn't know were even politically engaged or even really interested in politics were becoming interested in politics. And it was really exciting for me as a millennial because I was being a part of something that I had only really read about in other periods in history. I could imagine what the revolutionary generation had gone through when they were reading Thomas Paine and when they were reading Thomas Jefferson, or what the abolitionist generation had gone through when they were reading the works of Harriet Beecher Stowe, like Uncle Tom's Cabin, or reading the works of Frederick Douglass, or the civil rights generation marching with Dr. King and Selma, or listening to Malcolm, or listening to the Black Panthers. They were. This was the first time in my generation that we were politically engaged, we were politically plugged in, we were politically excited about a candidate, and it was because of the proliferation of the internet. Yeah, we had Clinton, coming in 1992, and Clinton again in '96, and the thing is too, we didn't think he would get elected because a lot of since 1976, Shirley Chisholm was the first African American woman to vote, and they weren't taken seriously. Likewise, Jesse Jackson in 1984 and 1988, respectively, they weren't really taken seriously, or they were tripped up by something that they had said in the press. And Al Sharpton ran in 2000, he wasn't taken seriously. So African American candidates were not really taken seriously either in the primaries or especially in the general election. Even the Democrats did not really take um, Barack Obama seriously at first. It was pretty much in 2008, it was pretty much in the bag for Hillary, and people thought Hillary was going to brush over all the Democratic candidates, including Obama, including John Edwards and other ones. And she was going to be like Goldberg in the wrestling ring, and she was just going to, you know, it was going to be an easy win for her, but it wasn't that. You know what I mean? For some reason, Obama connected with the audience. He won the Democratic nomination, and then he went on to defeat John Kerry that historic night. And it was unbelievable. It was surreal. It was magical. People were crying in the audience. People from the civil rights generation who had to drink at separate water fountains and who were abused by these conservative governors and all that, you know, in the South, like um, George Wallace and those, and had dogs sicked on them and had water fountain, hydrants sprayed at them, you know, lynched, abused, degraded. They finally had some vindication. There was a story about it, like a 90-something-year-old woman that cast her vote, that she was around during the time of Jim Crow, and she was able to cast her vote for Obama. And it was just magical hearing him say those words, change has come to America. That was a surreal night that I will never, ever forget for as long as I live. And Obama still continues to astound the world today, long after his presidency. You know, he paved the way for Joe Biden, the current president of the United States. Joe Biden was his vice president for his 2 terms. And me, Lisa, and I went to the art exhibit about him. I got both he and his wife's biographies. I love his family. He was free of any personal scandal other than the lies that they made up with him. See, that was the thing. When you were a Democrat in the 90s, it was like you couldn't defend Bill Clinton. You might have liked him as a president. You might have said, well, the economy boomed under him. It had very little to do with him. It had more to do with the invention of the internet and the dot-com boom. But you could not defend him as a person because of the things he did that were reprehensible to women and to his own wife. You know what I mean? So much like his namesake, his middle name is William Jefferson Clinton. So much like Thomas Jefferson, his namesake, he was a questionable character personally. But Obama wasn't that. Obama was a family man. Obama's family was picture perfect. 2 beautiful girls, Malia and Sasha, 2 dogs, a beautiful wife, a beautiful relationship. Michelle Obama coming from the south side of Chicago, one of the worst um, economically deprived places in the United States, but still articulate, still, smart, a lawyer. It was a beautiful, picturesque life, that people could look up to. It was sort of like America's royal family, like a black Camelot, if you will. You know, there, it was like a fairy tale. Barack Obama, beautiful individual, beautiful person, and he has to make the list. Why he doesn't make it higher, you know, higher because he's recent and people will say, of course, because I voted for him, I supported him, I liked him, I was lived through his presidency, so he can't really rank, high in terms of, above Lincoln or Washington or Jefferson or FDR or Kennedy because he's still alive. So people would have got upset if I would have ranked him as number one. You know what I mean? But in my heart, he's number one because I was there, and it was a great moment to be an American at that particular time in history in 2008, and I will never, ever, ever forget it for as long as I live. And again, he's number one to me. We say he wasn't the first one that I mentioned, but he is my personal favorite. Um, Again, it was a situation that he was faced with a tremendous situation. He could have used that opportunity to abuse his executive power, to overrun the country, and to become a dictator. I don't think the country would have allowed him to do that. If he would have started doing that, they probably would have murdered him. You know what I mean? But he didn't do it anyway. And plus, in 2015, he extended um, marriage rights. You know, uh, it was the court case of Oberfeld versus Hodges that extended, marriage equality to all. But Barack Obama did back up marriage equality and became the first president or presidential candidate to come out in support of marriage equality for LGBT individuals. Now, people will say, "Well, okay," they're gonna say like with Kennedy and Lincoln. Well, he didn't he didn't support it at first. You know what I mean? He came out in 2008 and he said during the debates then he didn't support same-sex marriage. Again, it's politics. You can't always say what you really want to say at the particular time because the temperature of society doesn't allow for that. You know what I mean? You want to protect yourself and you have to say what's expedient in order for you to get in. Just like with Lincoln and Kennedy. They couldn't be automatically one for abolition and one for civil rights automatically. So Obama couldn't do the same thing with same-sex marriage. It wasn't that he didn't like gay people or that he was homophobic necessarily, because you never heard him say homophobic stuff. You know what I mean? So you don't have that necessarily dirt on him. Um, the healthcare thing, we say yes, he tried to get um, universal health care for every American, and he went further than every other U.S. president who has tried to get it. Many other Democratic presidents before him tried, but they were unsuccessful. But he was, he didn't do as much as he could have done. You know what I mean? His hands were tied in that because Republicans never allowed him to do that, possibly because they were racist and he was the first African American president. And he was also a political outsider. He was only a senator for 2 years, and that was probably another reason why they didn't want to do it. When he got in, the Republicans at that time said, "We're gonna everything he's gonna say, we're gonna say no, we're against it." So everything he tried to do, they blocked him at every turn. You know what I mean? So he did more than other presidents in terms of healthcare, but he didn't do enough. You know, but given the situation, he did as best he could. So I'm not gonna beat up on him for that. His successor now, going back to him, Donald Trump. Lisa asked the question before, did I like Donald Trump? Well, I'll be honest, given the choices between Donald Trump and Hillary Clinton in 2016, yes, I voted for Trump. People will say, well, was the difference? Okay, you were excited about Obama. You were excited about Obama in 2008. You were excited about him in 2012. What was the difference? Why switch complete allegiances? Well, I wasn't the only person to do that. A lot of people, if they didn't like Hillary in 2008, why would they like her in 2016? She was the same person then that she wasn't, 8 years later. Why would they vote for that person? You know what I mean? The Republic and the Democrats failed to nominate somebody new, somebody different, somebody who would continue on what Obama was trying to do with Bernie. In fact, there was evidence that Hillary, manipulated the polling to win the primary against Bernie. Bernie was going to take the ball further than Obama with the healthcare thing. He was going to create a system of universal healthcare, but he didn't win. And many people were upset Okay, you didn't, Lisa. I understand that, but many people did. You know, you know, we all admit that we made a mistake, but in trying to explain that mistake, we try to explain, why we did. Because a lot of the Bernie supporters felt that Bernie was treated unjustly by Hillary, that she felt entitled to the Democratic nomination, that she dropped out of the race in 2008, and she, felt like this was her turn. She had been the Secretary of State under Barack Obama, and she felt like this was her turn. And a lot of times we felt that she was entitled. Yes, it was going to be historic because she was going to, be the first female to be the U.S. president ever. You know what I mean? A lot of people felt that the Bernie Bros, the so-called Bernie Bros, were sexist. That even the Democratic supporters of Bernie Sanders were kind of sexist. That they didn't want to see a woman be in power, but it wasn't necessarily that they didn't want to, because a lot of people voted for Jill Stein, and the Jill Stein votes went to Trump anyway because he won. You know what I mean? Well, a lot of people were really upset that this reality TV show star with no political experience was just coming in and creating this megastorm. But see, Trump had seen what Obama had done in terms of the internet, and the internet had gone further now. Social media had become something that would dictate our lives, and we made the fatal mistake of electing a reality TV show star as our president just because we were so angry with the Democratic Party. Why Joe Biden had chosen not to run, so Joe Biden wasn't an option. The only option was Hillary, and people didn't like her. She was unlikable. And many people set that one out. Many people voted for Jill Stein, and some people, out of anger, like me, said, you know what? Fuck it. I'll vote for Trump, and I'll show the Democratic Party how they took us for granted by nominating Hillary. It was a mistake. It was a mistake, but we paid for it dearly. Many people did not agree with his political rhetoric. They did not agree with his racism and xenophobia that he started his campaign on June 15th, 2015, saying that Mexicans are terrible people, that Mexicans are coming across the border, they're raping people. People didn't agree with that. People such as myself, we wanted Bernie Sanders as the candidate. We wanted him to be the president. But when he was not chosen, the Bernie Bros either said that one out or they voted on the other side. Right. Lisa said she didn't talk to me. I lost a lot of friendships over doing that. And listen, I'm one vote. I didn't think he would win. I was just like, angry with the Democratic Party because I felt like, they were turning their backs on us as their supporters. It was just like it was we talked about in the Royal Rumble video where, the fans wanted Daniel Bryan, but the company went with Batista. Well, look at the Democratic Party as a company, right? As an organization, they went with Hillary, but we wanted Bernie. You know what I mean? So anyway, June 15th, 2015, Trump comes down the escalator, him and Melania, something that The Simpsons had parodied in the 90s, and he makes that historic speech. And I point out that day for a specific reason, and that reason is the day, June 15th, that in 1215, hundreds of years before that, and the Magna Carta is the intellectual ancestor of the Constitution. Basically, on the Magna Carta, Magna Carta established Parliament in England and limited the monarchy. So our system of representative government is directly related to that Magna Carta that was signed on that day, June 15th, 1215. So on the same day that the Magna Carta was signed, that was the day, hundreds of years later, Donald Trump announces his candidacy for president. And many would say destroyed um, the democracy, destroyed representative government. But I personally looked at it as a choice between the lesser of two evils. Of course, with hindsight not being 2020, I didn't foresee a global pandemic. I didn't foresee, you know, what I knew that he would be ignorant. I knew that he would be racist. I knew that he would continue U.S. imperialism overseas, but we had a lot of racist presidents. We had a lot of ignorant presidents. We had presidents that were slave owners. We had presidents that were imperialistic. I didn't think he would do that much damage, in terms of, the pandemic. You know what I mean? Lisa was smarter than me. Lisa was right. I was wrong. I admit it. I was wrong. If I could go back in time and go back to 2016 and recast my vote for Hillary, I would cast my vote for Hillary. Right. But people like me that voted for him at that time, Lisa, we didn't foresee that. We could not have foreseen such a thing like that. We could not have foreseen that. We didn't possess a crystal ball at that time. You know, what I mean? Right. That was the vote that I personally regret. If I could take it back, I would. But it was what it was. I voted for him at the time. I didn't support him. That's the difference. I voted for him, but I didn't support him. I never put out Trump 2016 banners on my wheelchair or anything, or my front lawn or nothing. I didn't support him. I voted for him, yes, but I did not support him. That's a difference. Now there are people here that support him. People here on my other video that they they like Trump. Whatever you like Trump, that's your personal opinion. My personal opinion is that I did not like him. I was not satisfied with the way that he ran the country. Um, he was responsible for a global pandemic, more for incompetence, I feel, than malice. I feel like he was not okay. Lisa saying voting for him is supporting him. No, supporting him, Lisa, is supporting him. You know, being, putting out banners. I donated to Barack Obama's campaign. You know what I mean? I didn't donate to Donald Trump's campaign. There's a big difference between that. I felt a part of Barack Obama's campaign. I didn't feel a part of Trump's campaign. It was a protest vote. Who else didn't I like? Well, in history, we know the bad ones, the ones that were not so great. And that's James Buchanan is one. James Buchanan was the president before the Civil War, and he failed to prevent the Civil War. He was the first bachelor who was a president. That is an unknown fact about him. Many think that he was secretly gay. Herbert Hoover, the president during the Great Depression, also failed to stop the Great Depression from happening and actually made it worse. Many people say, people were so bad at him at that time that they created these shanty towns, these little poor towns uh, of of these little slum villages, these little slums, Skid Row type settlements called Hoovervilles. They were doing it intentionally to mock him. He was not a very good president, but he and his wife did a little known fact about he and his wife. They spoke in Mandarin Chinese to each other so the White House staff wouldn't eavesdrop. Another president I'm not particularly fond of was the president during my lifetime, George W. Bush. George W. Bush, I feel, go back to the 2000 video, came in unfair. His brother was the governor of the state of Florida, and that was the disputed state. That was the state where they had to do the recount and everything, because him and Gore were at a tie in 2000. And I still feel, even though the claim is unsubstantiated, I feel that his brother probably had something to do with him getting elected. Plus, his brother executed Eileen Wuornos, one of the first female serial killers in history. That the the movie, the 2003 movie starring Charlize Theron is based on, and him supporting her execution helped get him elected governor. And him being governor, I think, had something to do with his brother getting elected president. So it's a domino effect. Eileen Wuornos never kills those 7 men. Jeb Bush never uses her as a political tools to get elected in Florida. Then he doesn't then use his governorship to help his brother get elected president in the year 2000, and then we eventually don't go to war in 2001, maybe. I always wonder how would have life been different here in the United States if Al Gore had been elected. How would Al Gore have handled the situation on September the 11th? Would that even have happened? Because it always seems like these Middle Eastern governments always attack the United States, when we have these Republicans in office. For 8 years, we had Bill Clinton. We never faced none of these attacks. Only in the beginning in 1993, the Ramzi Youssef attack. But other than that, we didn't really face anything in the 90s, really. Stuff happened, in Kosovo and Rwanda and places like that, but it happened overseas. It didn't really happen here. You know what I mean? But then as soon as we get a Republican in office again, the son of, that person, all of a sudden they start going to war with us again. What's the son of the last guy we had in that went to a Middle Eastern war in the early 90s? You know what I mean? So what's really going, like Arn Anderson would say, what's causing all this? What's really going on? Why is these Middle Eastern countries attacking us only when we have Bushes in office. Doesn't make sense. Maybe they have something against the Bushes. I don't know. But George Bush is one of the worst, presidents. Like Lisa said, Florida is always something. Florida is very unpredictable. Large Cuban American population that mostly supports Republicans. Um, what did George Bush do that was good? He was against Trump. I mean, that was about it. Um, and some of his faith-based initiatives were pretty good, and he was friendly with Barack Obama. Junior, senior. Okay, senior was a one-term president, and a lot of times one-term presidents are considered disasters, like Trump, like Jimmy Carter, like um, George Bush Senior. But Senior wasn't that bad. You know what I mean? Yes, he launched the Persian Gulf War because he felt like he was stopping a despot, Saddam Hussein, and then he failed to capture Saddam Hussein. He left it up to his son. But and he did it, in support of Kuwait because Saddam was trying to monopolize the oil in the Middle East and trying to invade a competitor's territory in the petroleum business. So, that's why he did it. But he wasn't that bad. He was not elected because he said he wasn't going to raise taxes. Read my lips, no new taxes, and he raised taxes anyway. And the economy tanked. When he was on the campaign trail in '92, so people went with a fresh face in Bill Clinton. But he wasn't all that bad. Junior, on the other hand, was all that bad. Junior had um, the Great Recession. He had the two wars in Iraq, the two wars in the Middle East, Afghanistan and Iraq, respectively, that he started. He did, yes, Senior passed the ADA. That is true, Lisa. So that was good about him. And he wasn't all that bad. At that time, he was considered pretty terrible. You know what I mean? But he was a moderate. Same thing with this guy. And this guy, in history, I feel like he gets unfairly maligned because of the Watergate scandal and because of how he cheated against George McGovern in the 1972 election. And this guy is Richard Nixon. In history, Richard Nixon, they record him as the worst president ever. Before Trump and before George W. Bush, he was persona non grata when it came to political history. And when he died in 1994, he died having kids like me think that he was one of the bad ones. But he really wasn't all that bad. He did do a lot of stuff for the environment, and he was pretty liberal by today's standards. Um, he did use a Southern strategy to get elected, most like all the Republican presidents, and Reagan and even Bush Sr., used a lot of race baiting. He showed pictures of this man named Willie Horton that the prison had let out on a furlough and tried to equate criminality with blackness. So he used a lot of racial tactics um, to get elected as well in 1988. Bush Sr., that is. Nixon started that. Nixon started that in 1968, trying to appeal to white voters and using dog whistle politics in order to get white voters to switch from Democrat to Republican. So Nixon was bad on that front. And with Watergate and with racism, Lisa. And also, he said he was going to pull out of Vietnam, and he did not. He did eventually pull out of Vietnam, but years and years after he said he was going to, and he launched an offensive in Cambodia, a neighboring country. So he was bad on that front. He had a lot of bad things, but in terms of the domestic economy, besides racism, I mean, he's a Republican. So, how much do you really expect him to be that racially enlightened? You know what I mean? But in terms of the economy, in terms of the environment, starting the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, he was pretty good. So I can't really say. Jimmy Carter. Now, Jimmy Carter was president before I was born. He was elected in 1976 as president, defeating Gerald Ford, who was the previous president after Nixon had got impeached. Spiro Agnew, his vice president, also got thrown out of office. So um, they had to pick the Speaker of the House at that time, which is the natural succession. It goes from president, then the president gets impeached or dies, and it goes to vice. And then from there, it goes to Speaker of the House. So they elected Gerald Ford as Speaker of the House, and then he was elected president. But he was defeated by Jimmy Carter. And one thing I always liked about Jimmy Carter, besides his emphasis on his insistence on his faith and his humbleness, he actually admitted in a Playboy interview in the '70s that he had lust in his heart. A lot of men would not even admit to that. You know what I mean? He was married and he was admitting, you know what, I have weaknesses too. I suffer with lust. And he was a born again Christian. He was one of the things I liked about him in his campaign speech. He didn't say, I will do this, I will do that, I will do this. He said, I will try to be the best president that I can be. And I hope that I can live up to your expectations as a president. He was always honest with the American people. He was always forthright with the American people. Sometimes he was too honest. Sometimes he was too humble. Like when we were going through the oil crisis in the mid '70s, he actually said it was time for Americans to tighten our belts. It was, that was FDR. He said he had polio. It was time for us to, be a little bit more economically responsible. He gave the famous Malaise speech, Jimmy Carter did. And, Americans didn't like it because us as Americans, we don't like to be told that we're not the best. We don't like to be told that we're not the greatest. So when our president, who is a leader, is telling us that we're not the best and we're not the greatest, and is being humble and being honest with us, we don't like that. We want to be lied to. We want to be bullshitted. We want to be, you know, like the song says, "Tell me lies, tell me sweet little lies." You know, we want America to be grandiose. We want our presidents to tell us we're the best. Tell me I'm the best. Tell me I'm the best. And that's what Carter didn't do, and that's what his successor Ronald Reagan did do. Ronald Reagan was an actor from movies, the first Hollywood president, and a lot of his speeches were, coming out of movie scripts. He quoted Star Wars, he quoted Back to the Future, all these '80s movies and stuff. He was totally opposite of Carter. But as far as having a disability, FDR was the one, Lisa, that did have a disability. He had polio, he was afflicted with polio, and because of that, he was skittish. He appeared that he was very skittish. He appeared that he didn't want to appear weak. He famously never appeared in his wheelchair, only when he had the Treaty of Yalta, which with Joseph Stalin and Winston Churchill, which many people say was when he surrendered all of Eastern Europe over to the Soviet Union. So he never wanted to appear vulnerable, never wanted to appear in his wheelchair. He always wanted to appear strong. Also, Teddy Roosevelt was another president that was stricken heavily with asthma. And actually, Teddy Roosevelt was shot, during on the campaign for his campaign for re-election, and he actually continued his speech going and going. But in terms of Jimmy Carter, in terms of the good parts of Jimmy Carter, getting the Camp David Accords signed in 1979, the first historic accords between an Arab country, Egypt, and Israel, was a step in the right direction for the Middle East. And Israel and Egypt still have relations to this day. So, even though he ranks as one of the worst presidents because of how he was appearing weak, he was a weak leader, and he mishandled the Iranian hostage crisis in 1979. He did do a good thing in the 1970s with ending the Yom Kippur War and, trying to bring lasting peace to the Middle East. People say he was anti-Semitic. I don't know about him being anti-Semitic. He's a hardcore Christian. How can he be anti-Semitic? I doubt he was that. You know what I mean? They say it because he wrote the book Apartheid, about the unfair treatment of the Palestinians. So you're going to write a book about racial injustice, and of course you're going to get some kind of backlash. But he had some good points and he had some bad points, like all the presidents. They had some good and they had some bad. A lot of them had really bad. Like when it's bad, it's really bad. Racism, slavery, imperialism. Andrew Jackson, he did expand the voting rights to poor whites, where originally the founding fathers had designed and set up in terms of landowning whites. And Andrew Jackson expanded it to poor whites. But Andrew Jackson has a blot on his name for not only his slave owning, but also his genocide of the American Indians in the Trail of Tears in the 1830s. So the founder of the Democratic Party here has a really bad blot on his name. So that's pretty much it. Yes, Lisa is correct. Jimmy is the longest living president. Jimmy Carter is still alive. So maybe being a one-term president is not all that bad, guys, because yes, he lost his bid for re-election in 1980, but he gained life, and he has become a humanitarian ambassador for goodwill. The man who defeated him, Ronald Reagan, is now dead. you know. So, hey, I'd rather have a long life than 2 terms as president. You know what I mean? So, George Bush also lived a very long life with his 1-term presidency. There's a lot of stress being the president of the United States, being the chief executive officer of the country, being the leader of the free world, especially as the American Republic expanded years and years. Like it was very small at the time of George Washington, the 13 colonies. It became bigger as years went on. And years by years, as Lisa is saying, you know, the country became bigger and it became a bigger responsibility. Now, America is at a place and really been at a place since the end of World War II that um, we are now the babysitter of the entire world. We are in charge of the whole Middle East. Something goes down in the Middle East, they want us to fix it. Something goes down with Russia and the Ukraine, they want us to fix it. We're the last remaining superpower in the world. One good thing I want to add before leaving this video about FDR, he did help to end prohibition. Prohibition, the 18th Amendment, was one of the stupidest amendments that we've ever passed. The complete banning of alcohol, which allowed for the mafia, you know, Lisa and I talked about this before, allow for the mafia and organized crime to become a thing, for them to rise in power. And that's basically the first bracket and the first business that the mafia ever had control of. And it was one of the stupidest laws ever. How are you going to ever stop people from drinking? I understand the intent behind it, or at least what they tell us was the intent behind it, to stop domestic abuse and to empower women. It was part of the Jacksonian Reform era, the temperance movement. A lot of men were, at home, coming home drunk from the bar and abusing women. So, women's rights organizations wanted to have alcohol banned, and they succeeded. The temperance movement succeeded in the passage of the 18th Amendment, but it proved to be unsuccessful. You just couldn't stop Americans from drinking, and if if the government's not going to be able to regulate it, what's going to happen is going to be the rise of the black markets, rise of underground economies, and that's exactly what happened. And the mafia became really powerful during Prohibition. So that was one good thing that another good thing that FDR did. Helping to end Prohibition, helping to, the 20th Amendment. The 21st Amendment, helping to end Prohibition. What is my hope for the future presidencies? Lisa, I hope to see a female president one day. Father of daughters, a girl dad. I would love to see a female president one day. Somebody that is good, somebody that is a good role model for women. Now, people are going to say, wait a minute, what? You hope to see a female president one day? You had your chance in 2016 to cast your vote for the first female president, and you didn't do it. Okay, y'all are never going to let me live that down. I seem like an ultimate hypocrite by saying that I want a female president, and I had the chance to see that happen, and it didn't happen. But I did want a female president even then, but I didn't want Hillary Clinton. You know, just because I didn't want her doesn't mean I don't want a female president. I do. We never had a female president, but we currently do have a female vice president, Kamala Harris, who was elected. Kamala Harris, excuse me, who was elected in 2020 in a very historic election that I was also a part of. And then I voted for Joe Biden. I didn't vote for Trump a second time. When you know better, you do better, guys. You can only make a mistake once. So in this historic election in 2020, I did vote for Joe Biden, and part of his ticket was Kamala Harris. And seeing Kamala Harris make that speech in 2020 in the largest. What about a Hispanic president? Now, okay, yes, I'm Hispanic, and I would love to see a Hispanic president too. But again, it has to be the right person, the right man or woman for the job. Ted Cruz is out. Marco Rubio, not somebody that I feel represents. The Hispanic vote is very hard because, unlike the Black American experience, Hispanics come from different ethnicities and all have different politics. Cuban Americans tend to vote right wing. Puerto Ricans in New York tend to vote left wing, and Chicanos in California and Texas and Tejanos in Texas and California tend to vote one way. So I would love to see it, Lisa, but it's going to be very difficult because we all have different agendas. We're not marching to the same beat because of the historical experience of racial injustice against African Americans. African Americans faced the same hurdles everywhere in the country, so it was a good way for them to unify, in a sense, politically and socially. Okay, yeah, we're all on the same page because we all get treated the same exact way. With Hispanics, that's not really the case. You know what I mean? Like, Everybody's on a different page. Nobody agrees with each other. Nobody even identifies with each other. Chicanos feel one way, Boricuas feel one way, Dominicans feel another way, Cubans feel another way. They feel pride in their country first, their country of origin first, and not necessarily their ethnicity. Second generation, third generation Hispanic Americans like me, you know, do feel a sense of Hispanidad, a sense of Latinidad, a sense of unity among Hispanics, among Hispanics as a raza, as Hispanics as a people, but first generation Hispanics really don't. You know what I mean? They see themselves primarily as citizens of their country, and that's what they care about first and foremost. You know what I mean? So that I would love to see Elisa, but I think that's going to take a very long time. You know, hopefully not. Hopefully we have somebody charismatic that can bring the Hispanic people together and be on the same political, same political page, and that will happen someday. But it seems very elusive. That is a political equivalent of like how we used to say we would love to see a black WWE champion, and we never thought it would happen, but it did. You know what I mean? So you never, you never know. You know, what I mean? It might not be that elusive. So I hope it happens someday. Lisa, to answer your question, um, a president that is LGBT would be great to see. LGBT American. I mean, yes, James Buchanan was LGBT on the DL, you know what I mean? But somebody like a Pete Buttigieg or somebody like that, no, that's not necessarily Pete Buttigieg. I think he's a little bit too young, but I did like um, his style in 2020 when he was running in the primaries. And again, he's a family man. He's married, he has a husband, he's with kids. But I'm gonna throw this one out to you guys: a family man, married with kids, LGBT type marriage. All these people are all married. All these people are all conventional Americans. They fit into neat boxes as conventional Americans with families. And I'm a family guy. You know what I mean? I'm the closest thing you'll come to on YouTube to Peter Griffin. I believe in family. I'm always talking about family, always advocating family. I was for marriage equality and all that. I'm for families. So I would support Mr. Buttigieg on that. But here's one that I'm going to throw out to you guys. What about somebody single? What about a single parent as a president? Not married, not the traditional conventional family, whether it be straight or gay, not a married person, somebody who's single, somebody who's just coming out there, they're unmarried. You know what I mean? They have no, or somebody who has no kids. You know what I mean? Or a single mother. We're seeing all kinds of different families now in America. We're seeing all kinds of different definitions of family. So, but I don't really think America is ready for that, Lisa. I would vote for them too if they're a good person, if I feel like they represent that. But Americans, people, see, this goes back to the thing with FDR with the wheelchair. It's like they expect their leaders to look a certain way, to act a certain way, to families to be a certain way. They buy into this notion of traditional American values that have to do with family, and it's expanded to include LGBT people, to include African Americans, minorities, or whatever. But it always is that same box, that same, like, everything is family, family, family. You know, you like nowadays you can be gay, but you still gotta have a family. You still gotta say you're married. You still gotta say you love your spouse. You still gotta put on certain pretenses in certain ways. You know what I mean? So, like, and religion is another big one. What about a Muslim person? You know what I mean? What about a Jewish person? What about an atheist? You know what I mean? Like, America still has a long way to go. We still, and even African Americans. What about, okay, Barack Obama is biracial, but what about somebody that is not biracial? Somebody that has two black parentages? Is America ready for that? Is America ready for a dark skinned person as president? Our presidencies still have a long way to go. What about a poor person? What about somebody that's not from a political background? You may like or not like Trump, you know what I mean, whatever. But one thing, he paved the way kind of for somebody without political experience, to be in the White House. Now that might not necessarily be a good thing because at least they don't have political experience, but you want them to be educated, on politics. You want them to be worldly. But there's so many different options. So many different avenues that we haven't explored in terms of the chief executive officer, in terms of the office of president that can be explored. This prestige, this office seems out of the reach for so many people. People that are gay, people that are disabled, people that are of a certain skin tone, people that are of a certain economic background, and it shouldn't be. You know what I mean? This is America. United we stand, for liberty and justice for all. I challenge you to live up to that creed. That's what Dr. King was about. That's the ideals that Dr. King represented. And I feel like had Dr. King not died, not died, but not been assassinated by a assassin's bullet. When I was a little kid, and I really didn't, I'm not a real little kid, like 3 or 4 years old, I didn't really know anything about American history. I used to think Dr. King was one of the presidents. But I feel like had Dr. King not been assassinated, he would have been one of the presidents. You know what I mean? Because he he represented the highest ideals of what the founding fathers had envisioned for America. He represented the vision of what America could be, and not always has been. So he was he's kind of an unofficial 47th president, in my opinion. So I throw him in that lot, even though he was never the president. I consider him kind of like the president, kind of like president adjacent. Um, Lisa, people say, well, what about Dwayne Johnson, The Rock? Listen, uh, celebrities, I don't know about that. You know what I mean? Like, we had a bad experience with Trump. You know what I mean? So uh, I know, you know, Dwayne Johnson come from a very prestigious family, a very um, highly regarded family, but nothing to do with politics. And I don't think he knows enough. Like the answers that he, the answers that he be given, you know what I mean? Like in interviews are so vague and so much platitudes. Like we don't really know what Dwayne really believes. You know what I mean? Yeah, we don't exactly. I don't either. We don't really know what he believes. Like all we know is that he is charismatic and he's a good speaker. You know what I mean? And then we need more than that. We need substance behind that. Because for all we know, Dwayne Johnson were to get in hypothetically, he could have, the political people pulling his strings all the time and just being a puppet and saying whatever they want him to say. We don't know what he actually believes. We don't know anything about his core political beliefs. When people said in 2017 or 18, oh, he could he could be, the next president of the United States or the second biracial president. I thought they was just saying it as a joke, you know, and and then no, he actually had a presidential committee organized. I'm like, no, no, like, no, The Rock, you know, you're taking it too far. Like, and same thing with Tiger King's Joe Exotic. I don't. I think with Trump, it got to a level like it was just like with Trump. It started off as a joke, and then people started, taking it really serious. Like, you know, so no, like Lisa said, we don't need any more celebrity presidents. So no to The Rock. You know what I mean? I love The Rock. I was there when he first debuted in '96 in Madison Square Garden. I watched him, climb to the highest heights in the WWE as well as in Hollywood, but that's where he should stay. Hollywood, no more political presidents. Kanye West, there's another guy who got on an award show and said that he was going to run for president, and people were taking him serious, and he was actually on the ballot in 2020. Another guy who people are saying, run, Kanye, run, No. Kanye should never be within 20 or 30 feet of the White House because he's a mentally unstable individual and he's going through a lot of emotional problems right now with his breakup with Kim Kardashian, her going out with Pete Davidson and stuff. And he's not a person that knows anything really about politics. When you ask these people, these celebrities, even Trump back in the day, hard hitting political questions, they give you vague answers, which proves they know nothing about it. I can sit here right now and give vague answers about football, but that doesn't mean I know. That's showing you that I don't know anything about football because I'm not getting into specifics. And that's like with these people. You ask them a political question, they give an answer. They give a vague general answer. Like, I believe in freedom. Okay, but define what you mean by freedom. Define what you mean by you believe in democracy, you believe in equality for all. Can you get into specifics, sir or ma'am, about what that is? What your actual core political beliefs is, and they know nothing. A complete blank. The only celebrity, and he's passed away right now, that I would have seen had he been more mature, being in politics, would be Tupac. You know, I would have loved to have seen Tupac. Maybe not the president. Maybe this is the president. Maybe not the president. Maybe some lower office getting involved with politics. Maybe I would have loved it because at least even as a 16-year-old, because of his mother and because of his background, he knew a lot. You know what I mean? He was well educated on it. Not like these other celebrities like the Kanyes and the Dwayne Johnsons of the world, where you ask them, or the Roseanne Barrs, you ask them something and they give you vague general answers, and they obviously don't know what the hell they're talking about, but you know they want to, they think that the presidency is another reality show. you know, like, so Tupac was the only really one, really, you know. Other than that, no. Any of these other celebrities, you know, no. We saw what happened when Al Franken from Saturday Night Live got in. We saw what happened with Reagan. We saw what happened with Trump. We saw what happened with all these other celebrities. Even Arnold Schwarzenegger, who put Tukey Williams to death, the last death penalty in the state of California in 2005. Not to say that he was a terrible governor, but the Tukey Williams shit is something that I will never forget. I mean, Tukey turned his life around. Tukey was trying to undo what he had done, in the streets, and he was a martyr for his cause. And The governor, Arnold Schwarzenegger, just put him to death coldly and callously. Didn't even consider that he had reformed his life and stuff like that. So we saw the rash decisions that celebrities make when they're given the reins of power, especially ones that are uneducated and just seek power. Because again, like George Washington said, absolute power corrupts absolutely. And given celebrities political power, Lisa is saying, hell no. But yeah, she said that Tupac would have been good in Cali because he would have united the gangs. He had a lot of influence when it come to political gangs, what I call local socialized tribes. Yeah, they're outside of the mainstream, but so is the mafia. And how come American entertainment glorifies the mafia but doesn't glorify, when it comes to black or Latino street gangs, oh, they're bad, but the mafia is good? You know, no, people that are kept outside of the mainstream political structure create their own parallel political structures because they don't have a voice in mainstream society. So they feel like they have to create something, you know, parallel to that in the underground world. What the mainstream society calls gangs. And Tupac had his ear to the streets with that. Tupac had his finger on the pulse of that and was able to communicate with the gangs through his Thug Life initiative. And Cali is the home of gangs, so he would have been great in Cali. Lisa's absolutely correct. Yeah. But all these other celebrities, hell no. You know what I mean? Unless they educate themselves and they become educated on that, I'll say no. I'll say that is not for them, the presidency. But the world is becoming more and more inclusive, and I celebrate the good, the bad, and the ugly of all these presidents. They're human beings, they're mortal men, they are fallible individuals. And I know, okay, red, white, and blue nationalists, people that, as I said in my previous video that have Yankee blood that bleed red, white, and blue would never agree to this, but I'm going to honor this man today in my video, even though he was never a president. He was a president of my consciousness, and today, um, in 1965, he was unfortunately assassinated as well, and that is Alhaj Malik Shabazz, Malcolm X. He was never the president, but he was a very skilled orator and a very skilled advocate for Black rights and Pan Africanism. And it was the fear of him also that initially propelled Lyndon Johnson to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and 65, because I think the American government felt, you know what, if we don't give MLK what he wanted, we're going to have to deal with these more militant, more ardent, more harsher voices like Malcolm X. And we're not going to, it'll be a cold day in hell where Malcolm and those brothers get to clapping their guns at us. You know what I'm saying? So they felt scared. They knew that Malcolm was going to do it by any means necessary, and the people that followed him, you know what I mean? So their scaredness and their fear of a black planet, as Chuck D would say, propelled them to pass those laws as well. So it's not really related to the video at all, really. But RIP to Malcolm X and Haj Malik Shabazz. Thank you for putting that book out and educating my mind as a 12-year-old young Hispanic man and starting me on my journey to consciousness. Afro Latino young man being educated, reading Malcolm X and thinking of him in the line of these presidents, of these great natural leaders and great natural orators. And I'll always pay respect and tribute to him on my channel for opening my mind and expanding my mind. Being one of the greatest figures in history and one of my historical idols. But again, to my American people, happy President's Day. Thank you, Lisa, for contributing. Don't forget again to listen to Hail to the Chief. And I don't care what president you like. We're all Americans, and we all love this country, and we all want to see the um, liberty and justice for all for this country. Love you. Oh yeah, and like, comment, and subscribe. Peace.